Welcome back to Night Whisper, where the line between truth and the unknown fades into shadow. If you're drawn to the strange, the hidden, and the stories that linger just beyond explanation, you're in the right place. Tonight, we return to a mystery that refuses to die: the men in black. Not the kind from movies or folklore, but the real ones. The ones witnesses describe in hushed voices, their faces drained of color, their memories fractured by encounters that leave more questions than answers. What you are about to hear isn't fiction. It's a trail of accounts, linked by fear, silence, and something far colder than human curiosity. It begins, as it often does, with a man who never sought attention. A researcher, not a dreamer. Dr. Richard Oppenheimer, a respected academic from Minnesota in the mid-1960s, known for his discipline, his calm reasoning, and his skepticism toward sensational claims. Yet, his search for order led him straight into the heart of chaos. At first, his work was simple: a catalog of local UFO sightings, an attempt to separate fact from fantasy. Farmers who saw discs over their fields, police officers who chased lights along rural roads, students who watched glowing shapes drift over frozen lakes. Each story was collected, organized, and filed. He treated every account as data, every witness as a source. But soon, the patterns became too clear to ignore. The same shapes, the same movements, the same metallic silence that witnesses said pressed against the night air like an invisible weight. By 1965, Oppenheimer's archive had become one of the most detailed private collections of UFO encounters in the Midwest. He had no intention of publishing it. It was simply research, the kind of quiet, meticulous work most academics do alone. Yet, something changed when his notes began to reference a recurring detail. Men in dark suits seen near the homes of witnesses after each sighting. Not police. Not agents. Just men who appeared, asked questions, and vanished. Their cars unmarked, their words memorized, their tone mechanical. At first, Oppenheimer thought it was coincidence, a product of paranoia spreading among frightened witnesses. But then, the pattern followed him. It started with a phone call that ended in silence. Then came the feeling of being watched, footsteps behind him at night, papers moved from his desk, drawers left slightly open. He tried to dismiss it, until the day they came. It was a gray morning. The university halls were quiet, the air heavy with the hum of fluorescent lights. Two men entered his office without knocking. They didn't speak their names or show credentials. Their suits were perfectly pressed, their shoes spotless. One of them walked straight to Oppenheimer's filing cabinet and placed a gloved hand on it, tapping lightly as if confirming ownership. The other man sat across from him, eyes sharp, face blank, and began to speak. He spoke of Oppenheimer's interviews, the witnesses, the transcripts. He repeated quotes word for word, phrases that had never been published, never shared. He named people Oppenheimer had met only once, in small towns hours away. He listed their statements in the exact order Oppenheimer had filed them. It was not a question. It was a demonstration. They knew everything. When Oppenheimer asked who they were, the man by the cabinet said only, "We represent security interests, no hunky name, no identification." The man at the desk added, "Your research is no longer required." His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was absolute. They did not threaten him, but their presence alone made resistance impossible. He pressed again, asking if they were with the Air Force or Project Blue Book. One replied, "Government." The other, after a pause, said, "Defense." The words were deliberately vague doors that led nowhere. They stood, looked once more at the cabinet, and left. No papers taken, no damage done. Just a void that seemed to grow as the door clicked shut behind them. In the days that followed, Oppenheimer tried to continue his work, convincing himself that it had been an intimidation attempt. Nothing more. But then, things began to change. Not all at once, but in small, unsettling ways. Files disappeared. Not the whole collection, just specific interviews. The same names the men had recited aloud. The cabinet's lock was intact, yet the gaps were obvious. In other cases, the files remained but had been altered. Dates changed, phrases rewritten in handwriting eerily similar to his own, sentences crossed out, diagrams slightly redrawn, enough to disrupt the consistency of his research, to make him doubt his own notes. Sometimes he would leave his office in perfect order, only to return and find a chair turned slightly, or a book reshelved upside down. It was as though the room itself was being rewritten, one object at a time. His colleagues noticed his growing unease. He stopped attending faculty gatherings. He began locking his office, even during short absences. Yet no matter how secure he made it, something always felt disturbed upon his return. The worst came one evening when he arrived home to find a car idling at the end of his street. Its headlights were off. The moment he stepped onto the porch, the engine revved softly, and the car drifted away into the dark. No license plate, no sound but the tires on gravel. It told no one, not his wife, not his department head. To speak of it felt dangerous. Instead, he packed his files into boxers and moved them into his basement, convinced it would offer some safety. But even there, the interference continued. Notes went missing. Pages returned with small marks that hadn't been there before. Black smudges, faint imprints, like gloved fingerprints pressed into the paper. Within months he stopped his research entirely. The cost was too high, the intrusion too deep. To his students, he was still the calm, methodical professor, but those who knew him well noticed the change. He avoided conversations about the sky, avoided late nights at the office. He began to age rapidly, the spark in his eyes replaced by quiet dread. Years later, when asked why he had abandoned his study, he would simply say, "It was no longer my work to do." No one ever confirmed who those men were or why they had targeted him. His files, once meticulous, were eventually donated to a local archive, though entire sections were missing. What survived, however, told more than he realized. In his notes, a recurring pattern emerged, not of the UFOs themselves, but of what followed them. Witnesses reported visitations, phone calls, and silent observers who appeared shortly after their encounters. Their descriptions were nearly identical to those of the men who visited Oppenheimer. Tall, pale, emotionless, dressed in black suits that seemed untouched by the elements. And across time, from Falcon Lake to Point Pleasant, from the deserts of Nevada to the towns of Ontario, the same pattern repeated. Encounters with the unknown, followed by visits from the men who erased the evidence. The phenomena changed shape, but the watchers remained constant. Oppenheimer's story wasn't unique. It was a piece of a larger mosaic, one that stretched far beyond Minnesota, beyond the 1960s, into a network of suppression and control that defied documentation. Those who looked too closely found themselves silenced, not through violence, but through quiet dismantling, reputations destroyed, files lost, and memories clouded by fear. For those who study the unexplained, Oppenheimer's warning still echoes. The danger lies not in what you see in the sky, but in who arrives after. The light fades. The air stills. And then comes the knock at the door. Dr. Richard Oppenheimer was not a man easily shaken. A lifelong academic, he had built his reputation on logic, evidence, and the steady rhythm of research. His days were spent in quiet lecture halls and under the glow of projector light, teaching students how to separate myth from data. But in the winter of 1982, something began to change. He stopped attending faculty gatherings. His notes, once meticulous, became scattered, and the calm certainty in his lectures began to crack. It had all started with a visit. Two men, unknown to anyone on campus, walked past the front desk of the university without identification. The secretary remembered their silence more than their faces. They asked where to find Dr. Oppenheimer, and moments later, they were in his office. No appointment, no greeting, just the soft click of the door shutting behind them. The conversation lasted less than an hour. No one overheard the words exchanged. But afterward, Oppenheimer looked pale, distracted, as if the foundation of his world had tilted. That night, the janitor noticed his office light still on after midnight, something the professor never did. When he peeked inside, Oppenheimer was sitting at his desk, staring at an empty page. The next morning, he submitted a formal request for leave. No one thought much of it at first. Academics often took breaks between projects. But Oppenheimer didn't go on vacation. He didn't visit family. He simply vanished. His apartment was left neatly arranged, bed made. This is why said keys on the counter. Only his research materials were missing. The police report was brief. No signs of struggle. No evidence of foul play. Subject voluntarily departed. But to those who knew him, that conclusion didn't fit. His research had become his life. He had been working on a massive catalog of UFO reports across the Midwest, tracking patterns of sightings over time. He had told colleagues that he was close to a discovery, something connecting multiple cases that official investigations had ignored. A week before his disappearance, he told Thomas Reed, a friend and fellow researcher, "The data doesn't just show lights. It shows behavior. Something intelligent, something deliberate." Reed recalled that Oppenheimer had seemed both excited and frightened. When pressed to explain further, he said only, "It's not about the sky. It's about the watchers." When Reed went to Oppenheimer's office after his disappearance, he found the room stripped of its essence. The books were still there, but the notebooks and papers were gone. The drawers had been emptied. The filing cabinet was locked, a lock that Red had never seen before. The janitor said 2 men had come by the day after Oppenheimer's leave began, claiming to be university auditors. They carried briefcases, wore black suits, and spoke little. After they left, the janitor noticed they had removed several boxes from the office. Weeks later, the university received a letter, postmarked from a small town in Ohio, but with no return address. It was typed, unsigned, but clearly written by Oppenheimer. "Do not look for me. The work was not mine to finish. The files are safe. Please tell no one." The letter was turned over to the police, who declared it sufficient proof of voluntary departure. Case closed. But for Reed and others who had known him, the letter raised more questions than it answered. For one, Oppenheimer never used a typewriter. His notes, his letters, his correspondence, all handwritten. Second, the phrasing felt wrong. The man they knew would never call his own work not mine to finish. And finally, the tone carried a chill like someone else had dictated it. In the months that followed, Reed began to notice strange events around campus. 2 men, unfamiliar, were seen walking near Oppenheimer's old office, sometimes standing by the windows late at night. A student claimed they asked about UFO research classes, though none were listed that semester. When questioned by security, they simply left, leaving no record of their names. The more Reed tried to preserve Oppenheimer's research, the more interference he encountered. Hard drives went missing from the archive room. Copies of reports disappeared from even his personal notes, kept locked in his desk, were once found rearranged, not taken, not destroyed, just touched, as if someone wanted him to know they had been there. By spring, rumors spread quietly among staff that the university had been contacted by federal visitors. No one confirmed it officially, but after that, any mention of UFO research was quietly removed from the academic catalog. Oppenheimer's name faded from university records within a year. His research, once publicly accessible, was moved to a restricted section of the archives, listed simply as unverified material. But some fragments survived. A few pages of photocopied notes, smuggled out by Reed, offered glimpses into what Oppenheimer had been studying. He had identified clusters of UFO sightings that aligned not by geography, but by personnel. In each case, a government or military project had been nearby, yet official logs denied any connection. The deeper he looked, the more he found a repeating pattern: 2 unknown men appearing after major incidents, asking witnesses to retract or remain silent. His notes ended mid-sentence, on the last page. The same 2 men appear across decades. The same description. They do not age. They do not change. That was where the handwriting stopped. The next page was blank. Reed would spend years trying to trace what happened to his friend. Private investigators found nothing. Oppenheimer's bank account went untouched. His driver's license was never used again, but there were faint traces. Glimpses like echoes. A motel manager in West Virginia reported a man fitting his description staying for 1 night, paying cash, and leaving before dawn. A gas station attendant in Kentucky recalled a quiet man who asked for a map and stared at the sky for several minutes before driving away. None of it was ever confirmed. The last possible sighting came from a small-town librarian in Tennessee. She remembered a pale, weary man coming in late one evening, asking if the library had any local records about official visitors. When she returned from the back room, he was gone. On the desk, she found a slip of paper that read, "They watch the watchers. What happened to Dr. Oppenheimer remains unsolved. His disappearance was never reopened, and his work never resolved. The boxers removed from his office were never catalogued, and the two men who visited him were never identified. But among those who study such encounters, the case is known as one of the clearest examples of intellectual suppression linked to the Men in Black phenomenon. A man who sought patterns of truth became part of one. His life, his work, and his silence all fit the same design. Some believe Oppenheimer discovered something too large to contain. Others say the Men in Black were not after information, but after the idea of curiosity itself, the drive to look where one is not supposed to. Years later, a student found an old cassette in a forgotten drawer of Oppenheimer's lecture hall. The label was handwritten, "Guest Lecture -1979. On it, his voice could be heard clearly. Near the end of the tape, he said something that now feels like a warning. The pursuit of truth is not a straight line, it's a circle. The more you learn, the closer you come to the point where the truth begins watching you back. The tape ends with the sound of a door opening, and silence. Dr. Richard Oppenheimer's story is not just a disappearance. It is a mirror held up to every researcher who dares to follow the unexplained. The deeper the investigation, the closer the watchers come. His fate reminds us that, in the study of the unknown, it's not always discovery that changes you. Sometimes, it's Sue notices that you're searching. Chicago, 1987. A cold November night. The city skyline shimmered with static light, antennas cutting through the fog like jagged bones. It was an ordinary Sunday evening. Sports, news, reruns, until the signal faltered at 9:14 p.m. Channel 9's broadcast of Doctor Who was abruptly hijacked. The screen flickered, then dissolved into chaos. A man appeared wearing a rubber mask of Max Headroom, the artificial TV personality famous at the time. Behind him, a sheet of corrugated metal spun slowly, imitating the background of the real show. Patis Wasanti. Comedy. His voice was distorted, his movements jerky and unnatural. He mumbled cryptic phrases, laughed mechanically, and spoke words that seemed to have no meaning. For 90 seconds, the hijacker owned the airwaves. Then the signal cut out. The station's engineers scrambled to recover control. They never found out who did it. To this day, no one knows. To the public, it was an infamous prank. A bizarre act of digital rebellion in the age before the internet. But to one man, it was something far stranger. His name was Alan Metzger, a freelance communications researcher. He had been documenting patterns in signal interference and unregistered transmissions for a small journal on emerging broadcast technologies. When the Max Headroom incident occurred, he was one of the first to record and analyze it. He studied the waveform, the frequency overlap, the bandwidth distortion. What he found disturbed him. The hijack had not come from a local transmitter. It had piggybacked from a remote frequency, one that required precision access military-grade equipment, not the tools of an amateur. Metzger noted the exact timing of the hijack, its entry and exit points, and filed a report. But a week later, that report vanished from the journal's archives. The editor told him it had been removed for national security concerns. Metzger didn't stop there. He had already duplicated the data on tapes and stored them in his apartment. But not long after, visitors began to appear. It started subtly. A black sedan parked across the street from his building. Same car every night, engine off, windows tinted. Once, when he left for groceries, he saw the reflection of two men sitting inside, motionless. He told himself it was coincidence. Then came the knock. Two men, both in dark suits, stood at his door. They introduced themselves as technicians from the FCC, investigating the broadcast hijack. Metzger remembered how strange their manner was. Polite, but empty, as if reading from memory. They asked about his recording equipment, his signal logs, and whether he had shared the tapes. He told them he hadn't. One of them smiled thinly and said, "Good. Keep it that way." Before leaving, The other man rested his hand on the table where the tapes were stacked. "These," he said, "could cause confusion. Best not to misinterpret what you've seen." After they left, Metzger noticed one tape missing. The next morning, he found his answering machine blinking. 3 messages, all blank, just static and faint clicks. The pattern repeated for days. Static, silence, clicks. He contacted the real FCC, who denied sending anyone to his address. There was no record of agents assigned to any broadcast investigation in Chicago that month. By December, Metzger had begun to fear he was being watched. He told a colleague that he was thinking of leaving the city for a while. "It's not the broadcast that scares me," he said. "It's the response." But he didn't leave. He couldn't let go of the mystery. He reanalyzed the remaining tapes, slowing them frame by frame. And then, hidden in the distortion, he found something no one else had noticed. A brief overlay in the static, half a second long. It wasn't part of the Max Headroom broadcast. It was a flash of text, barely visible. It read, "We see you." That discovery would be his last recorded note. On January 3rd, 1988, neighbors reported strange activity in Metzger's apartment. The lights flickered all night. At dawn, his door was found ajar. The tapes were gone. His notes were gone. Metzger was gone. Police found no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no theft of valuables. Just an empty room and the faint hum of a television left on a blank channel. Days later, the same black sedan was seen parked across the street again, then disappeared before officers could approach. The case went cold. Years later, portions of Metzger's recordings surfaced among UFO research. The tapes were degraded, but fragments of his notes survived. He had written something in the margins of one page. A sentence circled several times. The hijack showed what could be done with technology. The visit showed what could be done with silence. The Max Headroom signal hijack remains one of the most mysterious unsolved crimes in television history. It was public, recorded, and yet utterly untraceable. But Metzger's story adds another layer, one that connects a strange act of broadcast disruption to the same dark patterns seen across decades. Men appearing afterward, claiming authority, removing evidence, erasing records. The Max Headroom incident wasn't about UFOs. It wasn't about aliens or light in the sky. It was about control, who gets to speak, who gets to record, and who gets to decide what truth survives. For most people, the story ended when the screen went dark. For Metzger, it began there. He stepped into the unknown and paid the price for curiosity. Some believe he discovered that the hijack was a test, not by pranksters, but by entities monitoring how quickly a system could be silenced. Others think he stumbled upon a link between classified signal experiments and psychological operations. Whatever the truth, it vanished with him. Today, the Max Headroom broadcast is replayed online as a strange piece of retro folklore. But listen closely to the distortion, and some claim you can still hear faint clicks. The same rhythm found on Metzger's answering machine. 3 clicks. A pause. Then silence. It's the same pattern reported by witnesses of the men in black after receiving mysterious calls. A coincidence? Maybe. But those who study such a phenomena say that the coincidences always point to the same conclusion. Someone, or something, monitors not the events themselves, but the people who pay attention to them. In the end, the hijack wasn't just a moment of chaos on live television. It was a message disguised as madness, a warning, buried in noise, to anyone watching too closely. And like all the best warnings, it came too late. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, early 1980s. A quiet afternoon at the university library, the sound of pages turning, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional whisper of students studying in the corners. For Professor Peter Roish, it was an ordinary day until it wasn't. Roish wasn't a youth, not in the traditional sense. He was a folklorist, a scholar of myth and narrative. His work focused on how societies shape stories about the unknown, how fear becomes legend, and legend becomes history. He'd spent years documenting oral traditions, analyzing reports of unexplained phenomena, and comparing them across cultures. In his lectures, He spoke not of aliens or conspiracies, but of belief, of how communities create meaning from mystery. His students admired his calm, rational tone. He approached the strangest tales with academic discipline. He treated UFO stories the way others treated ghost folklore or ancient myth, as reflections of the human need to understand the unexplainable. That changed the day the mythology came for him. He was seated in the anthropology section, reviewing transcripts of rural UFO testimonies collected during the 1950s. He had been tracing a peculiar pattern to recurring description of men in dark suits visiting witnesses after sightings. Their behavior, their speech, even their unnatural pallor appeared in multiple unrelated accounts. To Roach it was fascinating, not as fact, but as folklore. A myth born from Cold War paranoia, filtered through the fear of government secrecy. He made notes in the margin. Symbolic authority, manufactured silence, shared narrative. Then he heard it, a voice. Flat. Close. He looked up. A man in a black suit sat across from him. Royich hadn't heard him approach, hadn't seen him enter. The man was tall, his face pale and expressionless. His suit was immaculate. Black tie, white shirt, polished shoes that reflected the overhead light. His eyes were sharp, unblinking. Royich hesitated, unsure whether to answer. Before he could speak, the man continued. "You study unidentified flying objects." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Roich's first thought was that he must be a colleague, perhaps from another department. "Yes," he replied cautiously. "I study the stories about them." The man tilted his head slightly. "What do you hope to discover?" Roich explained his research, that he sought to understand the social mechanisms behind belief, not the phenomenon itself. The man listened without expression, his gaze unwavering. "Ten asked. Do you believe the witnesses?" Roich paused. "Belief isn't my subject. Interpretation is." The man leaned forward, his tone lowering. "Will you publish your findings?" "I intend to," Roich said. The man's lips tightened into what might have been a smile, but it carried no warmth. "Some subjects," said slowly, "are better left unstudied." It was not advice. It was instruction. The man didn't answer. Instead, he adjusted his tie, stood, and said, "Be careful where curiosity leads you." Then he walked away quietly, efficiently, without a sound. When Roich looked up moments later, the man was gone. The reading room. The librarians hadn't noticed anyone enter or leave. No visitor had signed in that matched the description. Roich sat for a long time, staring at his open notebook. His pen had stopped mid-sentence. That night, he went home unsettled. He replayed the encounter over and over. The voice, "Te prasin," the way the man seemed to know his work, details that weren't public, papers not yet submitted. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a prank, or a misunderstanding. But as days passed, the rational explanations dissolved. When he returned to the library a week later, the seat across from his had been removed. The staff claimed they didn't recall doing it. In the months that followed, Roich changed. His lectures grew cautious. Where he once discussed UFO folklore with confidence, he now spoke in generalities, avoiding the subject of post-sighting visitations altogether. Students noticed the shift. He was quieter, more withdrawn. Colleagues asked if he was ill. He said he was fine, but his eyes told another story. Weary, watchful. One evening, after class, a fellow professor found him in the faculty lounge, staring at a blank page. "I can't stop thinking about it," Royak said quietly. The man wasn't interested in my research. He was interested in me. He never filed a report. "To the police," he reasoned. The story would sound absurd. A man in a suit. No name, no threat, no crime. Only words. But those words carried weight. They had shifted something inside him. He began to wonder whether his research had drawn attention from someone, or something beyond academia. He discreetly asked colleagues if any government agency monitored UFO studies. Some mentioned Project Blue Book, but that had ended in 1969. Others suggested the CIA, but no evidence supported it. No one could explain who the visitor had been. He described the man's voice in his private notes: monotone, precise, emotionless. The speech pattern matched descriptions from multiple witness accounts he had studied. In one entry, he wrote, "If I had not experienced it myself, I would dismiss it as metaphor, as time-passé paranoia replaced curiosity." Royich began to censor his own writing. He stopped submitting papers on UFO folklore, focusing instead on broader cultural myths. But even there, a subtle tension bled into his work. His tone had changed from observer to survivor. Students noticed he no longer stayed late at the library. "Ison se opandor palisi" turned into locked office hours. When asked why, he'd smile faintly and say, "Some subjects don't like being studied." By the late 1980s, he had all but abandoned his research on UFO narratives. His notes were stored in a locked drawer, rarely touched. But one evening, while organizing old folders, he noticed something strange. Pages missing, not misplaced, but surgically removed. No sign of forced entry, no damage, just absence. The missing sections were the ones describing the men in black. He knew then what his witnesses must have felt, that chilling sense of being observed by something unseen, unaccountable. He once wrote to a colleague, "I thought I was safe, because I studied stories, but the stories study us back." Over time, his encounter became a whispered legend within academic circles. Some dismissed it as stress, others as creative embellishment. But those who knew him best said he was never the same afterward. He stopped traveling for conferences. He stopped speaking publicly about his work. When pressed, he would only say, "I learned that silence is sometimes the only defense." Years later, when researchers revisited his case, they noticed a disturbing pattern. His experience was one of several similar incidents across North America in the 1980s. Academics, journalists, even local historians, all visited after publishing or preparing to publish material related to UFO phenomena. Always polite visitors, always in suits, always untraceable afterward. The details of Royich's visitor matched those reported in Canada, England, and Brazil. The same description, the same behavior, the same phrase repeated in multiple testimonies. Some things are better left unstudied. To this day, no one knows who the man was or how he learned of Royich's work. The university has no record of visitors, no footage, no entry logs. What remains are Royich's final handwritten notes, discovered after his death. On the last page, dated months after the encounter, he wrote a single line: "I have become part of the folklore I once studied." The library encounter remains one of the few Men in Black cases where the target was not a witness, but a scholar, someone who studied belief itself. It suggests that the phenomenon is not bound to the event, but to the observation of it. Perhaps the silence they enforce isn't meant to suppress the truth, but to preserve control over it. To decide who gets to tell the story, and who must forget it. For Peter Royich, the lesson was clear. Some stories don't want to be explained. Some shadows don't want to be named. And some men still walk quietly between the shelves, waiting for the next curious mind to look up from the page. In the winter of 1994, a small town in Wyoming experienced a series of power outages that seemed random. Short, silent flickers that left the streets dark 4 seconds before the hum of electricity returned. At first, no one cared. It was winter, after all. Snow on the lines, ice on the transformers, the usual, but to radio technician Alan Brooks, those flickers were more than a power problem. They were a patran. Brooks ran the local community broadcast station, WNOR, a small independent AM channel that played classic rock and nightly talk shows. He was a quiet man, a routine man. He liked things predictable. The steady pulse of static, the low hum of transmitters, the smell of warm circuitry. But one evening, during a late broadcast, he noticed something strange. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the transmission cut out, not into silence, but into noise. A wave of static filled the air, layered, rhythmic, almost structured. Brooks leaned closer to the receiver, adjusting the dials. Beneath the static, there was a pulse, like Morse code, but irregular, too fast for human timing. It wasn't random interference. It was deliberate. It recorded Italiano, 32 seconds of what sounded like garbled data, repeating 3 times before the signal vanished. When the station resumed, everything was normal. The music continued mid-song, as if nothing had happened. The next night, it happened again. Same time. Same signal. And on the third night, the same pattern, but slightly altered, as though something on the other end had realized it was being recorded. Brooks became obsessed. He isolated the signal's frequency, tracing it to a narrow band that shouldn't have existed in the local spectrum. He reached out to a few friends from his old amateur radio club. None of them could explain it. One caed an echo from something he altitude. Another suggested a government test. But Brooks wasn't convinced. He spent night replaying the audio, slowing it down, filtering the noise. Beneath the chaos, he detected faint modulations. Fragments that resembled human speech, distorted almost beyond recognition. One phrase, when reversed, sounded eerily like, "Do not listen." He laughed it off at first. Audio pareidolia. It told himself hearing meaning in meaningless sound. But the unease stayed. And then something began to happen at the station. It started small. Misplaced cables, flickering monitors, interference on other channels. Then, one night, while reviewing the latest recording, he noticed a shadow move across the reflection in the control room glass. He turned. No one was there. The next morning, 2 men arrived at the station. Black suits. Identical ties. Identical expressions. They introduced themselves as representatives from the Federal Communications Oversight Division. Brooks had never heard of such an agency. "Mr. Brooks," one of them said, his voice flat and deliberate, "we're here to discuss an irregularity detected in your transmission logs." Brooks nodded cautiously. "You mean the interference?" "Exactly," the man said. "We'd like to review your equipment and ensure that your recordings are not ... compromised." They spoke politely, without emotion, yet every sentence felt rehearsed, synchronized, as if shared between them. Brooks led them to the control room. They examined the consoles with a precision that seemed unnecessary for a simple interference report. One of the men asked, "Have you shared any of these recordings?" Brooks hesitated, just with a few radio operators. The man nodded slowly, eyes fixed on him. "You should retrieve them. Some frequencies are not meant for public use." When they left, Brooks checked the visitor log. No names, no signatures. The page for that date was blank. That night, the interference stopped. The station ran smoothly, for a week. There was silence. Brooks felt relief mixed with disappointment. He wondered if he had imagined the whole thing. Then, one evening, a package arrived. No return address. No sender. Just his name, typed in block letters. Inside was a cassette tape. The label read WANO Relastos y 13 AM. He inserted it into the deck, pressed play, and froze. It wasn't his recording. Not exactly. The signal was there, yes, but layered over it was something else. Faint breathing, and in the background, the sound of a man's voice whispering coordinates. He jotted them down. 4313, 107, 54W. A location deep in the Wind River Range, Wyoming. The next morning, he drove out there. The coordinates led to an empty clearing surrounded by forest. Nothing man-made. No antenna. No equipment. Just open ground and silence. But when he held up his portable radio, the same signal pulsed through the static. He tried to record it again. The moment he pressed record, his radio shut off. Dead. Batteries drained. That night, back home, his phone rang once. When he answered, there was only static. Then a voice, calm, monotone, unmistakable, spoke a single phrase. "You have been heard." The line went dead. After that, things changed. Neighbors claimed they saw men in dark cars parked near the station late at night. Brooks' coworkers noticed that he stopped answering calls, stopped attending morning briefings. The once orderly technician became erratic, paranoid. He installed locks, covered windows, unplugged equipment after every broadcast. 3 weeks later, he vanished. The police found the station empty. His car remained in the lot, keys still in the ignition. His tapes were gone, all except one. It was labeled static. When investigators played it, they heard only white noise. But at the 57-second mark, a faint voice emerged. It said, "We told you not to listen." The case was quietly closed as a mental breakdown. The official report cited fatigue, stress, and hallucination, but other operators in nearby towns began to report strange interference at the same time each night. Las 2:13 alto m. Each time the pattern appeared, it was slightly different. Asif adaptin, in the years that followed, amateur radio enthusiasts dubbed it the Brooks signal. It was rumored to appear only in remote frequencies, sometimes for seconds, sometimes for minutes, always carrying fragments of coded noise, sometimes resembling speech, sometimes pure static. Some say it's a form of surveillance, a ghost signal used to track unauthorized transmissions. Others believe it's something else entirely, a warning embedded in sound. What's most disturbing is that even today, technicians occasionally capture echoes of it. The timing never changes, 2:13 a.m. sharp. Experts have analyzed the recordings, calling them untraceable, with no known origin. But those who know the history, the story of Alan Brooks, see the pattern differently. They believe the signal is not just a transmission, but a message, a whisper encoded in static, reaching out to those who dare to listen too closely. Because in the world of the men in black, information isn't lost. It's monitored. And if you ever find yourself awake at 2:13 a.m., radio tuned to the edge of silence, and you hear a voice buried beneath the noise, don't listen too long. It might already be listening to you. The year was 1996. In Cambridge, Professor Elijah Munro taught at a quiet corner of the university's psychology department. He specialized in the study of perception, how the mind interprets what it sees. His lectures drew crowds, not because of theatrics, but because of his calm, logical dismantling of illusion. He believed that every ghost, UFO, and monster story was a mirror, reflecting human fear, not objective truth. But something changed that winter. One morning, a graduate student noticed Munro staring at his office window long after class. The lights of the campus glowed behind him, but he seemed transfixed, watching his reflection as if waiting for it to move. When the student asked if he was all right, Munro smiled and said, "Just studying perception." That phrase would take on a new meaning in the weeks that followed. It began after Munro received a package with no return address. Inside was a manila envelope filled with photocopied reports, transcripts of interviews with supposed UFO witnesses, each one describing encounters with men in dark suits. He assumed it was a prank. His name was known among skeptics, and debunking enthusiasts often sent him wild claims. Still, one detail caught his attention. Each interview contained nearly identical phrasing, cold voices, mirrored faces, unblinking eyes, and each ended with a phrase Do you see yourself? Do you see yourself? Curiosity won over skepticism. He decided to catalog the documents as part of a paper on repetitive archetypes in UFO folklore. But as he typed his notes, he noticed something subtle. The reflection in his computer monitor didn't move with him. When he leaned forward, the reflection delayed, half a second to slow. He dismissed it as fatigue. Days later, while preparing slides for his lecture, the same thing happened in a glass cabinet beside his desk. His reflection lagged again. Precise, deliberate. This time, he stood still and watched. The reflected version of himself blinked twice, even though he hadn't. That was when he stopped working for the night. By the next morning, the photocopied pages were gone from his desk. The cleaning staff claimed they hadn't touched anything. The office door was locked. He told a colleague about the reflection, trying to make sense of it. She laughed gently, suggesting he'd take a vacation. Monroy agreed, but privately, he began to record what he saw. He set up a small video camera on his desk, facing the window, left it running overnight, and reviewed the footage in the morning. For 6 nights, nothing happened. On the 7th, at precisely 3:04 a.m., the reflection in the glass shifted. It leaned forward, though Monroe himself was not in the room. The reflected figure moved closer to the window, and looked out toward the dark courtyard. Its lips moved, forming words the camera couldn't pick up. He froze the frame and leaned closer. Behind the reflected figure, 2 men appeared faintly in the background. Silhouettes, dressed in black. That same morning, a university security guard reported 2 visitors walking across the courtyard at 3:10 a.m. They were described as official-looking, wearing identical suits, carrying nothing. The security footage cut out for exactly 3 minutes. Monroe went to campus administration. They dismissed the incident as an equipment glitch. He insisted on checking the server logs, but they were mysteriously overwritten, the IT technician said. It's as if those minutes never existed. That evening, Monroe found a single new page sitting on his desk, a photocopy identical to the ones that had vanished. Across the top, a handwritten note. Do you see yourself yet? He left campus early and took a cab home. But the reflection followed him. In his apartment, every mirror seemed subtly wrong. The angles slightly off, the light bending differently. He covered them all, but even polished surfaces. His television screen, his window, the metal of a kettle, showed faint movements that didn't belong to him. He began to doubt his own senses. Was it stress, sleep deprivation, or was the phenomenon tied to those reports, the ones mentioning identical men who visited after seeing too much? He reached out to a journalist friend who'd written about the Men in Black cases years before. They agreed to meet at a diner near Harvard Square. Monroe brought a copy of the photocopied page, the one with a question. The journalist arrived late, apologetic. But when Monroe slid the paper across the table, the man's smile vanished. Where did you get this? He asked quietly. Monroe explained the package, the reflection, the visitors. The journalist listened in silence. Then he leaned forward and said, "Don't go back to your office." Before Monroe could ask why, 2 men in dark suits entered the diner. They didn't look around. They walked straight to the back booth, sat down, and faced the wall. The journalist whispered, "They always sit near exits. Don't make eye contact. Just leave." Monroe hesitated, glanced toward the men, and froze. Their faces, reflected in the window beside the booth, didn't match their bodies. In the reflection, they were smiling. That was the last confirmed sighting of Professor Elijah Monroe. He missed his next lecture. His apartment remained locked from the inside. The police found no signs of struggle, no signs of departure. His camera was still recording when they entered. The final footage showed his reflection standing by the window, even though Monroe himself was not in the frame. The university quietly removed his name from the active faculty list within a month. The official statement cited personal leave. But students began to whisper that, late at night, in the psychology building's top floor, the windows sometimes show 2 reflections where one should be. To this day, janitors avoid that floor after dark. They say that if you walk past the office of Elijah Monroe and catch your own reflection in the glass, you'll notice something impossible. A second version of yourself standing just behind you. And sometimes, if you wait long enough, it blinks when you don't. The Men in Black have been seen, recorded, and feared for decades. But in Monroe's case, they didn't visit in the physical sense. They entered through perception itself, through reflection, illusion, and the fragile boundary between what we see and what sees us. Because the question they left behind wasn't about sight at all. It was about awareness. Do you see yourself yet? The story began on a stormy evening in 2002. In a small coastal town outside Seattle. The kind of place where the fog rolls in thick, muting the world and turning every street light into a blurred halo. The town was quiet that night, except for one strange thing. For exactly 6 minutes, every television tuned to Channel 8 went black. Then, without warning, a new signal appeared. The image was simple but unsettling. A white room with a single chair, filmed from an overhead angle. No sound. No motion. Just the hum of static in that empty space on the screen. Viewers later described feeling a strange pressure in their chest as they watched, like the air itself had changed. Then, after those 6 minutes, the broadcast returned to normal programming. A late-night talk show that no one remembered afterward. At first, the interruption seemed like a technical glitch, but technicians at the local station confirmed it wasn't theirs. The signal had overridden their transmitter completely, something that should have been impossible without physical access. One of those technicians was Laura Jensen, a night engineer in her late 20s. She'd been the one on shift that night, alone in the control room when the feed went dead. The moment it happened, she said the lights flickered, her monitors filled with static, and then her screen displayed that white room. She thought it was a test pattern until she noticed something impossible. The reflection of the control room faintly visible in the corner of the broadcast. It wasn't a pre-recorded video. It was live. She grabbed her headset and called her supervisor. But when he answered, all she could hear was a low, rhythmic tone like breathing through a machine. Then, a whisper beneath the static. "Don't adjust the signal." The next second, the line went dead. After the broadcast ended, Laura saved the recording onto a tape. When engineers reviewed it the next morning, the file was gone from the archive system. Only the tape she had hidden in her locker remained. Within days, strangers began showing up at the station. 2 men, always the same. Dark suits, pale skin, no identification. They introduced themselves as federal consultants. They asked for access to the equipment, reviewed security footage, and then requested to see Laura privately. Her co-workers described their manner as polite but cold, their movements unnaturally synchronized. When one nodded, the other blinked. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. When she came out, she was pale and silent. She refused to say what had been discussed. Later, when a colleague asked, she simply said, "They already knew what I saw." That night, Laura went home early. She called a friend, a journalist named Evan Marrow, who had covered the old Max Headroom hijack case in the late 80s. She told him something was happening again. Another broadcast, another silence. He agreed to meet her the next morning, but she'd never arrived. Her car was found abandoned on the shoulder of a forest road, headlights still on, driver's door open. Inside was her work ID, her phone, and the tape she had copied from the control room feed. The tape had been cut, not snapped, not torn, cut clean through, as if with surgical precision. The local sheriff's department opened an investigation but found nothing. No signs of struggle, no footprints in the mud. Laura had vanished as if the fog had taken her. Evan began digging into her disappearance. He interviewed her co-workers, reviewed the equipment logs, and discovered something that the official report didn't mention at the exact minute Laura's car was found. Channel 8's transmission briefly flickered again. For 2 seconds, a single frame appeared. It showed that same white room. This time, the chair was no longer empty. Someone sat in it. Evan froze the frame and magnified it. The face was blurred, but the shape of the hair and outline of the jaw matched Laura Jensen. He sent the image to an expert for digital analysis. The expert never returned his call. When he drove to her office, it had been cleared out. Desk empty, computer missing. Within a week, Evan noticed a black sedan parked near his apartment every night. 2 men inside. No license plates. When he approached, they drove off without headlights. He called the FCC, the FBI, even the Air Force's Public Affairs Office, asking whether they had investigated the Channel 8 interruption. Each denied involvement. The FCC told him, "No such incident is on record." That was impossible. Thousands of viewers had seen it. Local news stations ran short reports that night, but by morning, those reports had disappeared from online archives, replaced with unrelated headlines. Evan went back to the broadcast station and convinced a friend to give him access to the backup server. Together, they combed through system logs. At 11:42 p.m., the exact time of the hijack, the console recorded a remote login from an unknown terminal, labeled only USER_MIB. The next line simply read, "Signal synchronized." Then, every entry after that was corrupted. 2 days later, the same friend called Evan in a panic. "They were here," he whispered. "They took the drives. They said it was for federal review. His voice trembled. Evan, they knew your name. The line went dead. Evan packed his notes, left the city, and never published the story. He told one close colleague before he vanished from journalism entirely. That colleague later recounted. He said the tape was still out there, but it doesn't play right anymore. When you hit play, it shows your own room like a mirror, and behind you, someone else is sitting. Years later, collectors of broadcast anomalies claim to have fragments of the Channel 8 hijack. None have verified the original. Some report hearing faint audio beneath the static. A female voice repeating, "Don't adjust the signal." Others say they've seen reflections that shouldn't be there, glimpses of rooms, people, or places that look eerily familiar. The Channel 8 incident became known in underground circles as the Vanishing Broadcast. Some called it a hoax, others a government experiment. But to those who study the Men in Black phenomenon, it fits the same pattern. An unexplained event, a witness who collects the evidence, visitors who arrive quietly and erase what remains. What makes this case unique is that the message wasn't verbal. It was Biswala broadcast that seemed to look back at its audience. If the earlier cases were warnings to individuals, this one was a demonstration to everyone watching. That's why the phrase haunts those who remember it. Not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. Don't adjust the signal. Because maybe the signal isn't what's broken. Maybe it's us. The event began quietly, as they always do, a flicker in the routine. A detail too strange to dismiss, but too subtle to report. It was 1989 in the outskirts of Toronto. A winter that had frozen the city into stillness. The streets were empty after dark, the snow muffling every sound. It was the kind of cold that carried silence in its teeth. Inside a modest brick house on Finch Avenue lived Dr. Harold Crane, a linguist and semi-retired professor. He was known among his colleagues for his study of coded languages, how secret groups communicate in ways that hide meaning in plain sight. After retirement, his curiosity turned toward an unexpected subject. Intercepted radio chatter tied to unidentified aerial sightings across southern Ontario. He wasn't chasing UFOs. He was chasing patterns in speech. Odd phrases repeated in military broadcasts. Numbers spoken with deliberate rhythm. Words that never appeared in official transcripts. To him, it was just another form of language. A riddle to be solved. That was, until the messages began to respond. Crane had set up an old shortwave receiver in his basement, a tangle of copper wire and vacuum tubes. Late, one January night, he tuned into a frequency that pulsed faintly between 5 and 6 megahertz, a band usually filled with distorted static. But what came through was not static. It was a voice. Soft, measured, and wrong. "Dr. Crane," it said. He froze. The voice was calm, too calm, with a hollow tone like air moving through metal. No one should have known he was listening. He spoke into the receiver, asking who it was. There was no answer, only the faint hum of electricity. Then, after 10 seconds of silence, "You have translated enough." The transmission cut off. The next morning, Crane found his basement window open. Snow had drifted in across the floor, though the latch was still locked from the inside. He dismissed it as a draft, but unease crept into his mind. He began documenting every anomaly, every strange sound. Every night, the static carried rhythm instead of noise. A notebook he had left on the left side of the desk appeared on the right. A pen that had rolled to the floor was returned to its exact place beside the receiver. Someone, or something, was paying attention. On February 3rd, he recorded another voice transmission at 3:14 a.m. The words were faint, but he caught enough to write them down. "We will be seated. Prepare the room." That morning, the snow outside his home showed a series of indentations, not footprints, but circular impressions, ebonly spaced, as if made by a machine that hovered inches above the ground. 3 nights later, the visit came. At 2:47 a.m., Crane woke to the sound of footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate. He lived alone. He grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the sound, his pulse hammering in his chest. As he reached the top of the basement stairs, the light flickered once, twice, and went out. In the dim glow of the hallway, he saw the outline of a figure standing by the window. Tall, thin, dressed in black. Its face was pale, featureless except for two eyes that didn't seem to reflect light. "Dr. Crane," it said, the same hollow voice from the radio. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The visitor tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. "You have translated enough." Crane stepped back, his hand trembling on the railing. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper. The figure did not answer. Instead, it raised one hand, not threateningly, but in a gesture of silence. Then, without crossing the room, without a single step, it was suddenly closer. The air grew heavy, electric, the smell of ozone filling the hallway. Crane felt a pressure behind his eyes, like someone was pushing memories out of place. The next thing he remembered was waking up on the floor. Morning light spilled across the room. The visitor was gone. His shortwave receiver was still humming faintly. The tape recorder attached to it had been stopped at exactly 3:00 a.m. On the tape, only one phrase was audible. "Erase the symbols." Crane checked his notes, the pages where he had copied fragments of the coded transmissions. Every line had been smeared with black ink, as though someone had brushed a wet cloth across them. But his ink bottle was sealed, untouched. He tried to contact colleagues at the university, hoping to share his findings, but the calls didn't go through. His phone line emitted a faint clicking sound before disconnecting. When he tried again, an unfamiliar voice answered, monotone, mechanical. "Dr. Crane is not available." He hung up. In the following days, his behavior changed. Neighbors said he became withdrawn, rarely leaving his house. Once a week, a black car appeared on the street outside. The same car, same time, same silent passengers. When a friend from the university finally visited, he found Crane's home in disarray. Books stacked to the ceiling, papers shredded in the sink, the shortwave radio dismantled on the floor. The professor sat at his desk, staring at a blank page. "They spoke through the static," he murmured. "They don't want words anymore." Within months, Crane disappeared. His house was sold by distant relatives. The radio, the notebooks, and the receiver were never found. Years later, fragments of his research surfaced through an estate sale. Among them was a single cassette labeled Sequence A. When played, it contained nothing but a steady low hum. But when the audio was spectrally analyzed, a pattern emerged, faint shapes forming letters that spelled three words: "We are listening." To investigators of the Men in Black phenomena, the Crane case represents one of the rare instances where communication came first and confrontation followed. Unlike witnesses who were silenced after an event, Crane was silenced for discovering the method of control itself, the manipulation of language and signal. In academic circles, his disappearance was dismissed as psychological breakdown, a mind lost in obsession. But among researchers of the unexplained, it became another entry in a growing pattern. A voice from nowhere, a visit without footprints, a message erased from record. What remains are only the echoes, the fragments of a man who tried to decode the voices in the dark and instead became part of their vocabulary. And somewhere, on a forgotten frequency, a faint hum still repeats through static, steady as a heartbeat, whispering in that same metallic tone. It began as a routine late-night shift at a local radio station in Arizona. The year was 1993, a time when analog dials ruled the airwaves, and static carried the ghosts of distant frequencies. The station, KTRX 107.4, was small but loyal to its midnight audience, truck drivers, night shift workers, and insomniacs who found comfort in the voice of Miles Donovan. A calm, methodical host who specialized in conspiracy talk shows. 4 years, Donovan entertained stories of UFOs, cryptids, and secret experiments. He didn't believe most of them, but the callers loved him. His show, Night Frequency, had become a ritual of sorts, a place where the unexplained had a voice, even if only for a few hours a week. But one night changed everything. It was a Wednesday, quiet, except for the soft hum of the sound. The lights in the booth flickered once as the clock struck 12:03 a.m. Donovan cleared his throat, adjusted the mic, and began with his usual opening line. "Good evening, insomniacs and believers. You're tuned into Night Frequency, where the dark has a signal of its own." His first caller introduced himself as Earl, a trucker driving along Interstate 40. His voice was shaky. He said he'd seen something in the desert, a silver shape hovering low over the sand, trailing beams of white light that didn't illuminate anything around them. Donovan was intrigued but skeptical. He asked for details. Then, without warning, the line filled with a piercing tone. Not feedback. Something deeper, almost like a vibration that reached through the equipment. The sound made the meter spike into red, then vanish. Silence followed. Donovan tapped the controls, frowning. The line was dead. He moved on, brushing it off as interference. But then the studio phone rang again. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't human. It was calm, toneless, and slightly distorted, as though speaking through layers of static. Do not continue the signal, Donovan Fruse. He thought it was a prank. He played along. You're on the air, he said, forcing a chuckle. Do not continue, the voice repeated. This frequency is not yours. The producer, sitting across the booth, gestured to cut the line. Donovan hesitated, then hit the button. The line went dead instantly, not disconnected, but wiped clean. The hum of the open channel gone as if it had never existed. Moments later, every monitor in the studio glitched. The clock froze at 12:09. For 5 seconds, all they heard was that low vibrating hum, the same tone that had interrupted Earl's call. Then, without anyone touching the controls, a new audio feed began broadcasting through the speakers. It wasn't music. It wasn't speech. It was a recording, faint, but unmistakably human. The voice was whispering numbers, one after another. Coordinates, perhaps latitude, longitude, or something else. 34.71, 117.88, 0.43. The producer scrambled to shut it off, but the switchboard didn't respond. Donovan leaned in, caught between fear and curiosity. The whispering continued, soft and rhythmic, until the final number ended with a single word. Prepare! The feed cut abruptly. The studio fell silent, except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Donovan's hands were trembling. He looked at his producer. What the hell was that? Neither could answer. They ran diagnostics on the system. No trace of any signal input, no record in the logs. But the recording had been captured on their backup tape. The next morning, Donovan brought the tape to the station manager. But when they tried to play it, the reel jammed. They opened it, and the tape inside was blank, as though it had been magnetically erased. By noon, 2 men arrived at the station. Black suits, dark glasses, federal badges with no agency name. They asked for Donovan by name. According to the receptionist, they were calm and polite. They said there had been an unauthorized transmission involving restricted frequencies, and that they needed to interview the staff for national security reasons. When Donovan met them in the hallway, they asked only 3 questions. What did you hear? Who did you tell? Did you keep a copy? He told them about the recording, about the numbers, about the strange message. They exchanged a glance. Then one of them said quietly, "This never happened. The signal was an equipment malfunction." You understand? Donovan tried to argue, but the taller agent leaned closer. His voice was cold, emotionless. The frequency used is no longer active. Do not broadcast there again. And just like that, they left. No paperwork, no names, no trace they'd ever been there. That night, when Donovan returned to the studio, the booth door was locked from the inside. Security found no one there, but the equipment had been rearranged perfectly, symmetrically, as if someone had taken apart every console and reassembled it in mirror image. Even the labels on the switches had been reversed. He didn't go on air that night. A week later, Donovan tried again, broadcasting from home on a different channel. But halfway through his first show, he noticed something wrong with the signal delay. An echo, a fraction of a second off. When he listened closely, he realized the echo wasn't his voice. It was someone repeating him, word for word, slightly slower. He shut off the mic. The echo kept speaking. When he unplugged the equipment entirely, his speakers still whispered one last phrase, faint but unmistakable. "We warned you." After that night frequency ended without explanation. KTRX removed all its archived episodes. Donovan resigned a month later and moved out of state. Friends said he became reclusive, paranoid that every radio he passed was tuned to a station that didn't exist. Years later, when investigators examined KTRX's old frequency range, they discovered something strange. An unregistered broadcast signal repeating, a low-frequency tone every night at 12:09 a.m. The same minute the incident occurred. No station claims ownership. No transmission source has ever been located. Some researchers call it the Donovan Loop. Others believe it's a beacon, an ongoing transmission not from Earth, but for someone waiting to hear from us. And on certain nights, when the static clears just right, radio operators claim they can still hear a man's faint, steady voice whispering through the void calm, deliberate, as though still on air. This is Miles Donovan. And you're listening to the dark. To the dark. The case of Eleanor Grant was never meant to be connected to the Men in Black. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an isolated event. A woman living alone in a quiet part of Oregon, reporting something strange in her home. No lights in the sky, no strange signals on her television. Just silence. Eleanor was a sound engineer, retired from a long career in film audio restoration. Her job had been to bring old, damaged soundtracks back to life. Removing scratches, distortions, and noise from reels, long forgotten. After decades of working with sound, she was sensitive to its smallest details. She could hear the faintest hum of electricity, the softest resonance in a wall. But in early 2001, she began to notice something she had never encountered before, a total absence of sound. It started one morning when she dropped a spoon on the kitchen floor. She saw it hit the tile, but there was no sound, not even the faintest clink. She tapped the counter, snapped her fingers. Nothing. The rest of the house, however, was perfectly normal. The radio played in the living room, birds sang outside, and the fridge hummed. Only the kitchen was affected. Over the next few days, the silence spread. Room by room, sound began to vanish. The hallway lost its echo. The bedroom absorbed every footstep. Within a week, her entire house was dead quiet, a vacuum of silence so complete it made her dizzy. At first, Elena thought it was her hearing. She visited a doctor, underwent tests, and was told her ears were fine. "Perfect!" the audiologist said. In fact, better than average. So she invited her friend, a fellow sound engineer named Mark Leland, to visit. He brought professional microphones, recorders, and decibel meters. They entered the house, and immediately the equipment began to fail. The microphones picked up nothing. No hums, no movement, not even the soft crackle of electrical current. The decibel meter stayed locked at 0. Mark clapped his hands. Silence. He shouted. Nothing. Yet both of them could see his mouth moving, could feel the vibration in their throats. When they spoke, it was as if the air itself refused to carry sound. They tried again outside, a few feet from the front door, and everything returned to normal. Inside, silence. Outside, life. Mark, confused but fascinated, left his equipment running overnight. When he returned the next morning to collect it, he found all of the tapes blank, except for one. On that tape, for the first 6 seconds, there was a faint sound. Not words, not static, but a low-frequency hum that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Then, silence again. When Mark analyzed the hum through Spectrum software, he found something strange. The frequency, 37 Hz, matched no local equipment, no household appliance, no radio tower. But embedded in that hum was a secondary pattern, a modulation, too precise to be random. It was a signal. They played it again and again, slowing it down until the modulation formed something eerily familiar. A voice, a single sentence, distorted, almost beyond recognition. "You hear what we allow." Mark dismissed it as a malfunction, but Eleanor didn't. She knew what she heard, or rather, what she didn't. That night, she stayed awake, pacing her silent home. The world outside was alive with sound, the wind, the crickets, the distant hum of cars on the highway. But within her walls, nothing moved. It was like being sealed inside a vacuum. She tried turning on the TV. The screen lit up, the images moved, but there was no audio. She tried calling Mark, but when she spoke, she couldn't even hear her own voice. Then, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the lights dimmed. For a brief moment, the silence broke. A faint mechanical clicking sound came from the front door, like the tumblers of a lock being turned slowly. She froze. The door opened. Two men stepped inside, te were, tal expressionless, and perfectly still. Black suits, white shirts. No sound accompanied their movement, not the creak of the floorboards, not the rustle of their clothes. Even their footsteps were mute. One of them carried a small silver device that emitted a faint shimmer of light, no bigger than a coin. Eleanor tried to speak, but no voice came out. The man nearest to her looked up, tilting his head like a bird studying prey. His eyes were dark, reflective. When he finally spoke, his lips moved, but the words arrived directly inside her head, bypassing her ears entirely. "You record what you shouldn't." Her body tensed, her throat constricted, but she couldn't scream. The second man moved behind her, opened a drawer, and removed the tape Mark had left on the counter, the one containing the hum. He placed it inside a black case and shut it with precision. Then both men turned toward her again. The first one stepped closer, lowering his head until his face was inches from hers. His skin looked unreal, smooth, almost wax-like, as though stretched too tightly over something that wasn't entirely human. "Do not analyze the silence," he said. "It was not meant for you." Then they were gone. Eleanor stood frozen 4 minutes, unable to breathe. When she finally moved to the window, there was nothing outside. No car, no footsteps in the snow, no sign of visitors. But as she turned back into the house, something had changed. Sound had returned. The refrigerator buzzed, the heater rumbled, and the wind whispered faintly through the cracks in the window. Everything was normal again, except for one detail. Every clock in her house was stuck at 2:17 a.m. days later. When Mark returned, the house was still behaving strangely. Sometimes, during the night, the silence would creep back in, just for a few minutes, then fade again. He convinced Eleanor to move out, to leave everything behind. Before she left, she mailed the copy of her diary to a friend. A series of handwritten notes describing everything that had happened. But when the friend opened the envelope, every page was blank. The diary had been filled in ink. The ink was gone. No explanation, no trace, no chemical reaction could account for it. Eleanor vanished from public record shortly after relocating. Her house was sold, then abandoned after reports of strange acoustic anomalies surfaced among the new owners. Contractors who visited described entering rooms where sounds simply ceased. Their tools went quiet, voices muffled to nothing. Today, the property stands empty, its windows boarded, its address removed from most real estate databases. Locals call it the house with no sound. On clear nights, neighbors claim that when the wind blows in just the right direction, you can hear something faint from inside, not voices, not movement, but a slow, rhythmic hum, pulsing beneath the silence strained terahertz. The same frequency Eleanor once heard, the same hum the men in black erased. In the quiet basement of a regional historical society in Vermont, there worked a man named David Harker. He was not a scientist, not a researcher of UFOs, not even a believer in the strange. He was an archivist, the kind of person who dedicated his life to collecting, preserving, and cataloging other people's histories. His job was to restore fragile documents, label forgotten reels of and maintain the records no one else remembered existed. For years, Harker's work had been routine, even comforting. He liked order, the scent of old paper, the sound of drawers sliding open and shut. He often said that archives were safe places, immune to the chaos of the world above. But in the spring of 1998, that illusion of safety began to unravel. It started with a misfiled box. While inventorying a private donation from a defunct news agency, he found an unlabeled container, heavy, sealed, and older than the rest. When he pried it open, he discovered reels of 16mm film, a stack of correspondence, and a folder marked only with 3 faded letters, MIB. Inside the folder were carbon copies of letters exchanged between a freelance journalist named William Marks and his editor during the late 1950s. The letters discussed a series of interviews about UFO sightings in rural New England. Nothing unusual at first, but as the correspondence progressed, the tone shifted. Marks described being followed, receiving phone calls from men who refused to identify themselves, and seeing 2 figures in dark coats waiting across from his apartment. The last letter in the set was short, 1 sentence. They came to the door last night. I think this will be my final report. There were no later letters, no sign of the journalist ever again. Harker was used to unfinished stories, but something about this one lingered. The film reels in the same box were unmarked, but he decided to inspect them anyway. He loaded the first reel onto the old projector in the back room, the kind of machine that whirred softly as it spun to life. At first, the film showed nothing but static, grain, dust, empty frames, but about a minute in, the image flickered and resolved into something coherent. A man standing in a small apartment, holding a cigarette, looking toward the camera. There was no sound, but his lips were moving, as if speaking directly to the person behind the lens. Then, another figure entered the frame. A tall man in a dark suit and hat, face obscured by shadow. The first man's expression shifted from calm to alarm, back to wide gesturing at the camera, and the image shook violently before cutting off completely. The rest of the reel was blank. Harker watched the footage twice, maybe 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Was it staged a reenactment or actual evidence of the events the journalist had written about? He never got the chance to find out. The next morning, when he returned to the archive, the film was gone. The box was still there. But the reels and the folder marked MIB had vanished. There was no sign of forced entry. The security footage for that night was blank. The digital system had recorded nothing between midnight and 4 a.m. He asked his supervisor whether the collection had been moved. She checked the logs. No one had signed anything out. When Harker insisted that someone had taken it, she simply said, "Maybe you misplaced it." But he hadn't. He knew exactly where he had left it, locked in a metal drawer behind his desk. Later that day, while reviewing old microfilm, Harker noticed something odd on the reel labels. A small black circle stamped near the corner of each label that hadn't been there before. It was too uniform to be accidental, too precise to be smudged ink. It almost looked like a seal. That night, he stayed late, determined to go through the entire donation again. As the building emptied, the hum of the fluorescent lights became the only sound in the room. Then, somewhere behind him, came a faint click. The sound of the basement door opening. He looked up. 2 men stood at the bottom of the stairs. Both wore dark suits, their ties narrow and perfectly centered. Their faces were difficult to read under the dim light, as though the shadows clung too tightly to them. One of them spoke first, his tone soft but absolute. "You've been reviewing restricted materials." "I am an archivist," Harker replied. "Nothing here is restricted." The second man stepped forward, resting a hand on the metal drawer that had once held the MIB folder. "Some records are not for public access," he said, "even if they were never meant to be found." Harker's throat went dry. "Who are you?" The man ignored the question and opened the drawer. It was empty. Then he looked at Harker with a faint smile. Not friendly, not cruel, just void. "You will forget what you saw," he said, his voice almost hypnotic. "You will remember misfiling it." Harker blinked. For a brief moment, he felt his mind blur, like a fog pressing behind his eyes. When he looked up again, the men were gone. The drawer was closed. The lights flickered once, then stabilized. He didn't remember leaving that night, only that he woke up at home the next morning, sitting in his living room chair, still wearing his work clothes. He went back to the archive the next day, but something had changed. His keycard no longer worked. The supervisor told him his position had been terminated. "Budget cuts," she said. "You were notified last week." He never received any notice. In the months that followed, Harker began noticing small anomalies in his personal life. Books on his shelves rearranged themselves. His computer files disappeared or were renamed with strings of random letters. His home phone would ring once, at odd hours. Always one ring, never more. He tried contacting the Historical Society to request his personnel file, but they claimed no record of him ever being employed there. Even his name had been scrubbed from staff listings and newsletters. By winter, he had become obsessed with reconstructing what he'd seen. He built a new archive in his basement, not of documents, but of memories. Every night, he wrote down fragments of what he could recall from that missing footage. The man's expression, the shape of the second figure's hat, the brief flicker of fear before the reel went blank. Over time, he noticed something else. Whenever he wrote late at night, the basement light would dim slightly at first, then completely. Each time, he'd hear a low hum building beneath the silence, like a signal waiting to transmit. The last entry in his notebook, dated February 14th, 1999, read simply, "They don't erase the records. They erase the record keepers." After that, no one heard from him again. When police finally entered his home weeks later, they found his basement covered in pages of handwritten notes pinned to the walls. Every page contained fragments of sentences, patterns of names, and sketches of the same two faceless figures. But the strangest detail was found in the center of the room. A single 16mm projector, still running. The film reel inside showed nothing but static. And yet, when investigators stood in the room, some swore they could hear faint whispering under the hiss of the projector, like a man trying to speak from behind the noise. The case was closed as a psychological disappearance. But those who read the report said one thing was certain. Whatever David Harker found in that archive was never meant to be found, and the men who came for him didn't just want the evidence. They wanted the silence to remain perfect. It was late 2003 when Sarah Vance, an independent radio engineer from Portland, Oregon, stumbled upon a signal that should not have been there. She worked freelance, repairing transmitters, testing equipment for small community stations, and occasionally exploring the hidden corners of shortwave frequencies where strange things sometimes lived. Numbers, stations, Cold War relics, coded broadcasts. One night, while scanning an unused band between two maritime frequencies, she caught a transmission unlike anything she had ever heard. The sound was faint, but structured a voice, metallic and calm, repeating what sounded like coordinates followed by a phrase that made her pause. "Maintain silence. The signal persists." It repeated every 40 seconds. Then the frequency went dead. Sarah was used to oddities on the airwaves, distorted Morse code, pirate DJs, even prank transmissions. But this felt deliberate, official. She noted the frequency, time-stamped the signal, and recorded the last few seconds onto her computer. The next night, she checked again. Same time, same frequency. The voice returned, only this time the message ended differently. "Maintain silence. The signal persists. Interference will be visited." Those final words sent a chill through her. She decided to trace the signal. Using a handheld spectrum analyzer, she triangulated the source to somewhere near the old Mount Sylvan relay station, an abandoned communications tower decommissioned years earlier. The site was fenced off, rusting, surrounded by overgrown brush. It had no active power source, and yet her receiver showed a faint but unmistakable pulse, a heartbeat of transmission coming from deep within the structure. She told a friend, a fellow technician named Mark Delaney, who agreed to go with her. On a foggy Saturday morning, they packed portable gear and hiked up the service road to the station. The chain-link gate was unlocked. Inside, the tower loomed tall, cables hanging like vines, the building below it humming faintly with electricity. That hum shouldn't have existed. When they entered the control room, they found a single transmitter still connected to a working power supply. It wasn't modern equipment. It looked military, maybe 1970s or earlier. The dials were labeled in a language she didn't recognize. A low red light pulsed slowly on the panel. Mark tapped one of the gauges. The needle jumped, registering active broadcast. Sarah switched on her receiver, tuned it to the same frequency she'd heard from home, and froze. The voice was still there, repeating, calm and unbroken. Maintain silence. The signal persists. They stared at each other. Mark whispered, "It's broadcasting from right here." Before they could investigate further, they heard footsteps outside, deliberate, heavy, approaching the door. Thinking it might be security, they hid behind a metal console. The door creaked open. Two men stepped inside, both wearing black coats, despite the warm air. They didn't look around. They went straight to the transmitter. One of them spoke quietly into a small handheld device. "Unit secure. Recalibration complete." Then he turned off the main power. The red light faded. The voice stopped. Sarah and Mark held their breath as the men stood there silently for almost a full minute. Then one of them turned his head, hoosed slightly toward where they hid. His eyes caught the reflection from a console switch. Sarah would later swear that his eyes didn't reflect light the way human eyes should. He took a step toward them. Without thinking, Sarah pulled Mark's sleeve, and they bolted out through the side exit. The men didn't chase them, not immediately. But as they reached their car at the bottom of the road, a black SUV rolled up the opposite direction, silent, lights off. They didn't wait to see who was inside. By the time they reached the city, the fear had turned to adrenaline. Sarah reviewed her recorder. The final seconds captured before the power cut were clear: the metallic voice, the coordinates, and the phrase, "Interference will be visited." She backed up the file on multiple drives, uploaded one copy to a private server, and sent another to Mark. Then she tried to forget. But forgetting wasn't an option. The next morning, she found her home computer completely wiped. The drives were blank, as if freshly formatted. Her email accounts were inaccessible. Mark didn't answer his phone. When she went to his apartment, the door was slightly open. The place looked undisturbed, except for the faint smell of ozone that metallic temps left by electronics that had recently burned. On his desk was a note, handwritten in small, neat letters. "Do not return to the mountain." That night, she went on air through one of her small local radio stations and told a vague version of the story. No coordinates, no names, but enough to draw attention from fellow enthusiasts. Within hours, her signal was overridden by the same metallic voice, repeating calmly over her broadcast, "Unauthorized transmission, silence maintained." The station engineer called her, moments later, shaken. "I don't know what that was," he said. "It didn't come from us. It came from everywhere." The following day, Sarah was approached by two men outside a coffee shop downtown. They wore suits that seemed slightly out of date, black ties, and white shirts buttoned perfectly at the collar. One of them smiled politely. "Miss Vance," he said, "we'd like to discuss your recent experiments with radio frequencies." She asked who they were. "Technical oversight," he replied. They didn't show identification. Instead, they handed her a plain envelope and walked away. Inside was a printed message. No letterhead, no signature. "Cease. Signal analysis. The frequency's not yours." After that, Sarah stopped broadcasting. She sold most of her equipment, moved to a smaller apartment, and took work repairing consumer electronics. But sometimes, when she scanned through the radio bands late at night, out of habit more than curiosity, she could still hear the faint pulse of that voice under the noise floor. "Maintain silence. The signal persists." She told herself it was just a ghost signal, a looping fragment from an old broadcast that never truly ended. But then one night, the voice changed. It spoke her name. Her recorder caught only a few seconds before cutting out, but the words were unmistakable. "Sarah Vance. Silence will be maintained. No one has seen her since that night." Her apartment was found empty except for one item on the kitchen table, an unplugged radio, tuned to a dead frequency that still emitted a faint whisper. Investigators dismissed it as disappearance by voluntary relocation, but the engineers who reviewed the signal recording disagreed. One of them said quietly, That wasn't background noise. It was transmission, active and aware. Whatever the men in black are, they've always followed the flow of information, from physical encounters to digital broadcasts. Sarah's story proved that the phenomenon had evolved. It was no longer limited to those who saw too much, but now included those who heard too much. And somewhere, across the static of the forgotten airwaves, that same message continues to echo. Maintain silence. The signal persists. By 2005, the Men in Black phenomena had changed form again. No longer confined to isolated research, it began intersecting with the digital world, online archives, encrypted messages, and strange disappearances from within secure systems. Files vanished from government servers. Researchers who shared restricted images of unidentified aerial phenomena found their accounts deleted, their access revoked, their devices bricked. The story of Ethan Cole, a data analyst for a private aerospace contractor, marked the beginning of what investigators now call the vanishing point. Ethan wasn't a believer. His job was to clean up corrupted telemetry files and rebuild lost signal data from satellite feeds. He didn't care what the images were. He just needed the numbers to line up. But one day, while editing data from an atmospheric research probe, he noticed something unusual. The probe had captured a sequence of images that shouldn't have existed. Between two frames of clear sky, a dark circular object appeared, not blurred, not distorted, but perfectly defined. The metadata showed the object at an altitude impossible for known aircraft. Its shadow rippled across cloud layers like a pulse. He double-checked the data integrity. It was authentic. Curious, Ethan exported the images to his workstation. Within minutes, a warning popped up. Unauthorized transfer detected. File access revoked. He hadn't sent it anywhere. Then his monitor flickered. The cursor moved on its own. A message typed itself across the screen. File retrieval in progress. Maintain silence. He froze. The system logs updated faster than he could read them, one line after another, deleting directories, wiping storage sectors. When he yanked the power cable from the wall, the monitor stayed on for another full second before fading to black. That shouldn't have been possible. He went home early, shaken, but when he booted his personal laptop to review his backup drive, the files were gone. Every image, every cache, deleted remotely. In their place, a single text file remained. You were not meant to see it. The following morning, security escorted him to the HR office. They claimed his credentials had been used to access restricted material, and his clearance was revoked. Ethan insisted he hadn't shared anything, but his supervisors avoided eye contact. The meeting ended with his termination. By the time he returned home, his apartment door was unlocked. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been moved slightly. Drawers, papers, even framed photographs. His television flickered to static when he entered, and from within the noise he thought he heard a familiar phrase. Maintain silence. He unplugged it immediately. For the next few days, he stayed off the grid. No calls, no internet, but paranoia has its limits. On the fourth night, unable to sleep, he returned to his computer and decided to write down everything. Every detail of the incident, every timestamp, every file path. He encrypted the document, saved it on a flash drive, and mailed a copy to a journalist he once met at a technology conference. 2 days later, she received the envelope. It was empty. Ethan was never seen again. His apartment lease was terminated. His car remained parked outside for weeks, gathering dust until the landlord had it towed. But his story didn't end there. Moons later, a security technician from the same aerospace company found a hidden log entry buried in one of the system archives. It was timestamped the same day Ethan disappeared. The entry contained a string of text coordinates, followed by a simple phrase: collection successful, silence maintained. The coordinates led to a remote section of Nevada desert, an area off limits to civilian access. Satellite imagery showed nothing unusual, just barren land and long shadows. But when researchers attempted to view historical satellite data for that region, the images were missing. Every date returned an error. Meanwhile, online communities discussing Ethan's case began noticing something stranger. Posts about him, vanished within hours. Threads were deleted, archives corrupted. Even screenshots re-uploaded to image-sharing sites turned blank. Pure white rectangles. The more people tried to preserve his story, the more it seemed to erase itself. A former intelligence analyst, speaking anonymously, offered a chilling explanation. "The vanishing point isn't a person," he said. "It's a protocol. Once you cross it, once you interact with a certain layer of classified material, the system doesn't just delete the data. It deletes you from the network of record. You stop existing in the spaces where information is stored. In digital form, the men in black no longer needed to appear physically. They could silence through deletion, intimidate through disappearance, and erase by code." In 2007, a European cybersecurity firm encountered something that appeared related. While investigating data breaches on academic networks, they found encrypted packages labeled only with the tag MIB-alpha menos DCCT. The contents were corrupted, but fragments revealed short text strings. Each one a variation of the same message. Data observed. Witness located. Silence enforced. When they attempted to trace the source, their systems crashed, the servers overheated, and their internal logs rewrote themselves with timestamps from decades earlier. It was as though the code had reached backward in time. By now, the pattern was clear. The men in black had evolved into something larger, a mechanism that could operate through human agents, machines, or both. Wherever information spread faster than control could contain it, something or someone intervened. Researchers called it the digital hand, the unseen force that pulled threads from the web whenever truth threatened to surface. And yet, fragments kept slipping through. One of those fragments was a 16-second audio clip allegedly recovered from Ethan Cole's final session log. The recording contained the faint hum of a server room, followed by distorted voices layered beneath the sound of static. When filtered through spectral analysis, the whispers resolved into a single sentence. The ones who erase were once erased themselves. No one knew what it meant. Some claimed it was a warning that the men in black weren't protectors of secrets, but prisoners of them, forced to repeat the same act of suppression endlessly. But if that were true, then the system was far older and far deeper than anyone imagined. For every erased name, another shadow filled the space. Every deletion created a void, and every void became the birthplace of another watcher. And so, the vanishing point was never a place. It was a state of existence, a moment where the known world forgets you, but the unknown remembers. And somewhere, deep inside that forgotten silence, Ethan Cole's final transmission still loops a digital echo of one man who saw too much. Maintain silence. The system persists. By 2012, the men in black had adapted once again. They were no longer just figures at the edge of sightings or mysterious agents in black cars. They had become part of the electromagnetic world-day presence, not just seen, but heard. This phase of the phenomenon began with something so subtle that most people ignored it at first. A low, droning hum that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. In certain cities, entire neighborhoods began to report it. A deep, pulsing vibration that couldn't be traced to any source. Engineers called it the hum. Governments dismissed it as industrial noise, wind patterns, or even mass delusion. But among researchers who tracked the men in black phenomenon, a disturbing theory began to form. They called it the silent frequency, a signal that didn't just carry sound, but instruction. It began with Dr. Sylvia Trent, an acoustics expert from Vancouver. She had been investigating reports of the hum for over a year, using high-sensitivity microphones and magnetic sensors. Her recordings revealed something strange. Beneath the audible vibration was a modulation pattern, not random, not natural. It repeated every 43 seconds. When she converted the frequency into a visual spectrum, it formed shapes that resembled language symmetrical patterns, far too organized to be simple noise. Dr. Trent presented her findings at a small conference of sound engineers. Most dismissed her interpretation as pareidolia, the human tendency to see order in randomness. But one attendee, a linguist named David Rains, noticed something. The patterns resembled archaic binary communication, similar to what early computers used to encode short messages. The two began working together. They created software to decode the signal into digital text. What appeared on the screen chilled them both. "We are listening. Stop transmitting." They thought it was a glitch, an echo of the decoding algorithm. But the message changed each time they ran the analysis. "This frequency is not for you. Do not record. Cease translation." They tried from different equipment, in different cities, but the message always found them. Then, one night in November, Sylvia received an unexpected visit. She was in her lab after midnight, reviewing spectrograms, when the hum outside her building intensified. It was deeper, heavier, vibrating through the walls. The lights flickered, and her oscilloscopes froze. She felt a pressure in her chest, like the air itself was tightening. When she stepped outside, 2 black vehicles were parked across the street. The engines were off, but the headlights glowed faintly. No one moved inside them. The hum grew louder. Her microphones began to record without her touching the controls. In the playback, the hum was layered with voices, not speech, but murmurs, mechanical and cold. Identify, contain. Silence. She fled the building that night, leaving all her equipment behind. The next morning, the lab was sealed by unknown officials. Her access card stopped working. Her research account was deleted. Her colleague David tried to contact her, but she didn't answer. A week later, her apartment was found empty. Everything had been cleared out. Furniture, books, computer, even photographs. The landlord said she left quietly in the middle of the night. No one ever saw her again. But the hum didn't stop. In fact, it spread. By 2013, reports came from across the world. Bristol House, Auckland, Ontario. People described it as a vibration felt through the body, a deep resonance that seemed to come from beneath the ground or the sky itself. Some heard voices in it. Others experienced hallucinations, sleep paralysis, or blackouts. A retired communications engineer named Paul Jensen believed the hum was linked to low-frequency military transmissions. He built a homemade receiver to isolate the signal. What he captured wasn't human. The recording began with static, then a voiced faint, metallic, and calm. Observers active, sequence maintained. When he replayed it, the voice was gone. He tried again, recording directly to tape. The second playback contained a different message. "Why are you listening?" Paul destroyed the tapes that night, but neighbors later reported that 2 men had visited his home the next morning tall, dressed in black, moving with an almost synchronized stillness. They entered without knocking and left 10 minutes later. Paul didn't speak about it afterward. Within a month, he had moved away and cut off all contact. Independent researchers began calling it the acoustic interference of the men in black. The theory was that these entities, or the systems controlling them, had shifted their method from physical intimidation to frequency manipulation. Instead of knocking on doors or taking files, they now used the airwaves themselves sound as surveillance, tone as suppression. It wasn't just sound, either. People living near transmission hotspots reported strange dreams, vivid images of dark rooms, static screens, and silhouettes standing silently at the edges of vision. Some said they woke up to find their electronic devices turned on, recording with no prompt. A journalist named Clara Ruiz, who had been documenting these incidents, described one such dream in her notes. They stood at the end of a hallway made of light. No faces, no eyes-only form. When they spoke, it wasn't sound. It was vibration inside my head. They said, "You're hearing what we don't want heard." Then everything went quiet. Claire's article was never published. Her editor said she never sent it, but in her cloud drafts, a version appeared automatically, time-stamped 2 hours after she vanished. The title line read, "The silent frequencies they don't need to knock anymore." Today, researchers who investigate electromagnetic anomalies still report that certain frequency bands will shut down instruments when monitored for too long, equipment malfunctions, data corrupts, power drains suddenly. Some call it coincidence, others interference. But those who've experienced it firsthand describe something else to the sense of being listened to. Not by a machine, not by a person, but by the silence itself. One anonymous scientist, still active in the field, wrote in an encrypted forum post in 2018. The hum isn't mechanical. It's adaptive. When we change equipment, it changes tone. When we stop recording, it stops. When we start again, it waits, then returns. It's alive, in a way that sound shouldn't be. That post was deleted within an hour. The account was banned. If the vanishing point represented the Men in Black's control over digital existence, then the silent frequency was their hold on perception, itself a quiet reminder that sound, like memory, can be read. Because in a world where every signal carries information, silence is not absence, it's command. And those who listen too closely to the hum, to the vibration beneath the world's noise, soon discover that what's transmitting back isn't human. It's the sound of observation itself, and it never truly stops. By 2025, the stories had splintered into fragments, half memories, corrupted files, voices fading in static. The Men in Black were no longer whispers on the edge of UFO encounters. They had become something larger, woven into the very framework of communication itself. Wherever data flowed, they were there, silent, efficient, invisible. It all began with a simple broadcast anomaly. At 3:17 a.m. on a cold January night, every major shortwave frequency across North America briefly went silent. For a full 12 seconds, there was no transmission at all, not static, not interference, just pure, empty void. Then, a low, mechanical pulse emerged from the silence. Those who were awake to hear it described it as a heartbeat inside the air itself. Amateur radio enthusiasts scrambled to capture it. Emergency frequencies flickered alive, then went dead again. On police scanners, a single, chilling phrase repeated itself before vanishing into the ether. Sequenced complete, observation, shifting. At first, it was dismissed as a network glitch, perhaps solar interference, a common scapegoat. But researchers who had been tracking these phenomena knew better. The phrase matched a pattern. It had appeared in older, intercepted recordings from the 1990s, the same era when the secretive Project Grendel had allegedly tracked unregistered radio traffic connected to classified experiments. And that was when Dr. Aaron Lasker he had disappeared for nearly 2 years after his explosive exposure of the vanishing point. Most believed he was dead, another casualty in a silent war. But late that January, an encrypted video appeared on a forgotten data-sharing forum, posted under his initials. The video was shaky, filmed in a dim room lit only by the cold glow of a small monitor. His voice trembled, laced with exhaustion and fear, but his message was terrifyingly clear. "They're using sound now," he rasped. "Not to communicate it or rewrite memory. The hum you hear. It's not in your ears. It's in the recording layer of your devices. Every time you replay a memory, they adjust. Every time you remember, they correct." He leaned closer to the camera, his eyes wide and hollow, haunted by what he'd seen. "This isn't just surveillance anymore," he whispered. "It's reconstruction." The feed cut off abruptly, mid-sentence. No one ever confirmed where it was filmed, but within days, the clip vanished from every platform it had been shared on, replaced by a blank screen tagged with a familiar message. Error 404, file not found. Except one backup survived. A researcher named Ellen Cruz, whose work focused on sonic data corruption, had already mirrored the file offline just moments after it appeared. She was meticulous. Weeks later, when she finally played it back in the safety of her isolated lab, the audio had changed. Lasker's desperate warning was gone. The video now showed the same empty, dimly lit room, but a new voice spoke a voice that was low, rhythmic, and chillingly inhuman. "Transmission received. Containment complete. Cease dissemination." The voice had no traceable modulation pattern. It wasn't synthesized or recorded in any conventional sense. It was pure data, given a voice. After that discovery, Ellen stopped responding to emails. Her colleagues found her lab abandoned. A review of the building's power logs showed a strange pattern, a surge of activity every single night at exactly 3:17 a.m. The same minute the shortwave blackout had first occurred. And then the blackout returned. This time, it wasn't confined to niche radio frequencies, cell networks, GPS signals. Even heavily encrypted government communication channels flickered and died. For 7 seconds, global synchronization failed. Servers rebooted themselves without command. Traffic lights froze mid-sequence, causing chaos at silent intersections. Satellites blinked off in their orbits, then back on again. In that brief, worldwide window of silence, a hidden broadcast played through multiple private receivers simultaneously. Its waveform was unlike anything ever registered low, layered, structured like speech but coded in oscillating intervals. When computer scientists finally converted the signal into text, the message read, "You are observed. The study is complete. Transmission ends." Governments immediately denied it. The major networks issued statements blaming a cascading technical error caused by unprecedented solar flare interference. But the engineers who analyzed the raw data packets knew otherwise. The signal wasn't random noise. It had purpose. It followed complex mathematical sequences similar to those used in cognitive data storage. In other words, it was designed to be remembered. That's what made it so different. Previous phenomena faded over time, witnesses forgot. Recordings vanished. Archives were mysteriously deleted. But this transmission embedded itself directly into memory. Even people who never heard the broadcast reported strange, new recollections, afterward fragments of metallic voices in their thoughts, dreams of overwhelming static, and fleeting flashes of tall, featureless silhouettes watching them from a distance. It was as if the signal had infected thought itself. One pioneering neuroscientist, Dr. Marina Holt, theorized a name for it: cognitive resonance imprinting. She described it as a phenomenon where specific electromagnetic patterns align with human neural frequencies. In simpler terms, a broadcaster could program the brain. She conducted private studies, comparing the sleep patterns of subjects before and after the global blackout. Her results were astounding, showing a bizarre synchronization across subjects who had never met. They reported identical dreams, repeated the same strange phrases in their sleep, and gave identical descriptions of being watched through mirrors of sound. Her groundbreaking research never reached publication. Within weeks, her professional credentials were revoked. Her institution publicly denied her employment, and her entire digital presence was meticulously erased. Every photo, article, and reference to her work deleted as if she had never existed. The few colleagues who dared to speak about her said she left behind one final, cryptic note on her labs: WHITEBOARD. It'd read, "They've moved beyond watching, they're rewriting the observers." After that, a new term began circulating in the deepest corners of the web, among those who still investigated the men in black. They called it the final protocol to stage, where direct, physical encounters became obsolete. No more revisits, no more black cars, no more intimidating suits, only data, sound, and a profound, engineered silence. In this final phase, people didn't need to be told to stop investigating. They simply lost the will to continue. Their research files inexplicably corrupted. Their memories of key events faded and warped. Even their own written notes began to contradict themselves, with sentences rewriting on screens without any input, as if the truth itself was actively editing its own existence. One digital archivist named Victor Deal described it best in his private journal. "You think they erase data? They don't. They overwrite it. You don't lose the memory, you gain the wrong one." 2 weeks after that entry, Victor's system log showed his own handwriting reversing on the screen, the letters reordering themselves backward into nonsense. His final, coherent line read, "They're here, inside the signal." Then his journal stopped. By the middle of 2025, the blackout events had ceased. The strange hum from the airwaves quieted. Researchers stopped reporting new anomalies. For the first time in years, the static was gone. The silence returned, but It was not the natural, peaceful kind. It was sterile, manufactured, as if the entire electromagnetic spectrum had been scrubbed clean. And yet, scattered reports persisted whispers in hidden online archives. Private recordings never uploaded. Handwritten notes mailed anonymously from untraceable locations. Each one described the same recurring experience. A dream of a flickering screen, a man in black standing behind the glass, whispering in a voice that wasn't sound, but thought itself. The message was always the same. We were never watching you. You're always watching us. For those who have studied the phenomenon, the last transmission represents the closing act. The chilling moment, the watchers erase the line between observer and observed. It's the silence after the storm, a silence not of peace, but of complete replacement. Because maybe the men in black were never about men at all. Maybe they were the signal, a living system of control, evolving through every age of communication, from physical visits to electromagnetic interference to direct thought transmission. The pattern is clear. They don't suppress information anymore. They become it. And if you've ever heard the hum, seen the static flicker across your screen, or felt that strange, unshakable sense that someone is looking through your reflection, then maybe the last transmission never really ended. Maybe it's still playing, right now, waiting for you to listen. And when you do, it listens back.